Good morning, everyone. This is the panel on learning from indigenous human rights solutions. So welcome to the Paris Peace Forum. For everybody, I want to say first that interpretation in Spanish is available on channel 3. So for the people who are around, it's like channel 3. Okay? It seems that's not working for like the panelists. Like the interpretation is not working for the panelists. Yeah. Okay, so like the problem will be, it's being solved. So the interpretation in Spanish will be solved. So in the meantime, like I'll do like a short introduction of the panel, and then like the translation will start in Spanish. So it will start. So. Okay, perfect. So for centuries, indigenous communities have faced hardships and discrimination and social inequality. Like today, the situations persist, and they are 3 times nearly more likely to live in extreme poverty than their non-indigenous counterparts. So today, we will learn from indigenous human rights solutions on how they can protect their rights and also ensure like a contribution to the environmental preservation and also to the fight against climate change. Like they can also improve governance mechanism, ensure free access to information, and the goal of this panel is also to share experiences on how they can protect their traditional knowledge and better manage and collect data. So I'm just checking if like the panelists can now listen in Spanish before we start like the conversation. So okay. It's there's some technical issues, so I apologize for the panel. 0. Could you try 0? Like, is it working now? Like the translation in Spanish? Okay, so it's the channel is 0 for the people who wants the live interpretation in Spanish. So in order to start, we have only 45 minutes. So I want to give as much time as possible to all of my to the panelists. Personally, I'm Alexis Lafitan, Partnership Manager in the United Nations Development Program in Geneva. So let me introduce first Janet. Janet Ariola Sanchez is the founder and executive president of Patronato Pro Zona Masawa, the Mexico Indigenous Rights Observatory. So Janet, could you say a few words about your project, why you're here, and what does the Mexico Indigenous Observatory does?
Es un honor muy grande.
It's a great honor for me to be here with you. For 28 years now, I've been traveling through the indigenous peoples of my country because we're invited to do so. My foundation is like a bridge towards development, or I should perhaps say better quality of life and welfare of indigenous peoples. Through this observatory, I've been able to see how the mandates and the contents of national and international declarations can be heard and understood by indigenous peoples so that they can accede to their rights and be actors of their full development. My foundation has been working for 25 years now and is trying to ensure that all these rights are not just known but can be used to transform these territories so that we can eradicate extreme poverty and get rid of all the obstacles to full development and the full exercise of human rights affecting them. Thank you very much.
So let me also introduce now Silvana Baldovino, Biodiversity and Indigenous Peoples Program Director from the Sociedad per Derecho Ambiental de Peru, so the Society for Environmental Rights of Peru. So Silvana, can you say a few words about you and your projects, and what does the Sociedad Peruana del Derecho Ambiental hace?
Buenos días con todos y todas. Gracias,
Good morning,
Alexis.
everyone.
Gracias
Thank you,
por
Alexis.
compartir con ustedes la
Thank
mesa.
you for being here
La
to
Sociedad
share this
Peruana de Derecho
roundtable with
Ambiental es
us.
una institución que tiene más de
Our
36
institution
años
has
en el
been in
Perú
existence
trabajando
for
políticas
36
públicas
years in Peru, working
y
on
en el
public
transcurso
policies.
de los años
And
hemos
over the years,
identificado,
we have been
desarrollado y tomado
able to
conciencia de la importancia de
identify
trabajar directamente
and
con los actores
develop the
y con
importance
las
of working
personas que
directing
necesitan
with
estos
the
cambios.
people on the ground, the
Así es
people who
como
need this change.
llegamos a
This
tener
is
como
how
socios, aliados y
we
contraparte a las
have
organizaciones
partners and
indígenas, a las
allies in
organizaciones
the indigenous
representativas de los
peoples
pueblos.
and the
El Perú es
representative
un país
organizations
que
of those
tiene
peoples.
un patrimonio natural
It's a
y cultural
country
muy
that
grande. Sin
has
embargo,
extensive
estamos
cultural
retrasados en lo que es la
heritage.
defensa de los
Nonetheless,
derechos de nuestros pueblos
we are lagging
indígenas.
behind in terms
El
of
proyecto
defending
que
indigenous people's
presentamos al
rights.
foro
Our project
responde a
here in
una
the forum
necesidad de seguir reconociendo el
is
aporte de los pueblos
about
indígenas al patrimonio
recognizing
cultural,
the
no solamente
contribution
del
of
Perú,
indigenous
sino de la
peoples
humanidad.
to
Habla de los
cultural
conocimientos
heritage,
tradicionales,
not
conocimientos
just in our
tradicionales que son
country, but
aplicados
in
en
general.
temas
These
como
are
salud, educación,
traditional
vida
forms of
y
knowledge
en todos los
applicable to
niveles de
health,
desarrollo
education,
de
across
nosotros como
all
seres
forms
humanos.
of
Es un
development
aporte de los pueblos, no
as
solamente
people.
al
So
Perú
it's
por
a
ser nuestras
contribution
heridas y
not
parte de
just
nuestro
to
orgullo,
Peru,
sino también al
something
mundo,
we are proud
sirven
of
como
course, but also
mecanismos para
proud that it's
afrontar
contributing to
diversos
the world's
problemas como la crisis climática.
search for solutions to
Una
problems
muestra
such as
muy
climate
importante de la
change.
importancia de los conocimientos
An
tradicionales de
example
nuestros
of how
pueblos es
important
que surgieron y fueron de
traditional
mucha utilidad
knowledge
para enfrentar la
is
pandemia como
is
mecanismos de
that
defensa
they
frente al
identified during the
COVID-19.
pandemic
Se
ways of
identificaron
defending
mecanismos
ourselves against the
para
disease. There are
proteger
mechanisms
la salud de los
that
pueblos
can
para
protect
combatir la
people's
enfermedad.
health
El
and
proyecto
to try to
busca
cure
registrar
the
y
disease.
continuar registrando frente a
What
la
we're
autoridad
trying to
administrativa estos
do
conocimientos tradicionales,
is
no
form a
solamente como un
register, a
mecanismo de
list of
protección para
these
nosotros como
traditional
mundo, como ciudadanos,
forms of
como
medication,
personas,
so
sino
that
también para que
we
al
can use
evidenciar estos
this, of course,
conocimientos, los
as
pueblos
people,
puedan
but
tener
that
beneficios
also we can
económicos que
show
repercuten y mejoren sus
that
condiciones
indigenous
de vida.
peoples
Y
can
así también
contribute to
reconocer
improving our quality
el
of
rol de los
life.
pueblos indígenas
It's important to
y
recognize the
sus
role
aportes
of
frente al
indigenous
cambio
peoples
climático,
and their
como aportes en
contribution
salud y
to
como
the fight
aporte a todo
against
aquello que
climate change,
enriquece
to
el
health,
desarrollo de un ser
and
humano.
their
Muchas
contribution to
gracias.
everything
Muchas gracias,
that
Ivana. Thank you very much.
enriches human development. Thank you.
Next, we have Milady Dicue, Consular Asociación de Calvinos Indígenas del Norte del Cauca de Colombia. So from the indigenous human rights, indigenous communities of del Norte del Cauca, North Cauca in Colombia. So Milady, can you say a few words about your project, your organization, your indigenous group? Can you tell us what you do and or like why it's important also to be here in Paris?
Vale. Bueno, muy buenos días para todos los presentes en este espacio. Primero queremos agradecer,
digamos, ser tenidos en cuenta para
la participación en este espacio.
Really good
Somos pueblos indígenas del sur de Colombia, en Pueblo Nasa.
From the Nasa people from the south of Colombia, and we have our own system of government. So this is a baton that shows our position of authority. Our project is
digamos, un proceso que surge en el marco del conflicto armado en Colombia.
Colombia, pues, indigenous guardians. You know that in Colombia there was a conflict lasted 15 years, and now there's been a peace agreement signed. And according to that agreement, the indigenous peoples have this role of defending their people, their environment, and their region.
Con el conflicto armado, pues
muchos de nuestros líderes fueron asesinados. Conflict, we lost a lot of people. They were killed, and we need to do something about that.
De los mismos actores armados que han sido parte en el territorio, pero el rol también fundamental de la Guardia Indígena tiene que ver con la defensa del medio ambiente. Son como esos tres roles principales en los que está enfocado la Guardia Indígena.
Controlling that, and as such, we are focusing on these three areas: defending life, the territory, and the environment, of course.
So next to Milady, we have T3. He is the Executive Director and Editor-in-Chief of Open Development Cambodia. I'm very pleased also to have Tri in the panel with us. So Tri, same thing. Can you say a few words about you, your organization, what do you do, and what's also like the key priorities of your project?
Thank you much, Alexi, for giving me the opportunity to share about Open Development Cambodian project at the Paris Peace Forum. So Open Development Cambodian is a local organization based in Phnom Penh. We work around data collection and aggregation, provide up-to-date information on the open data portal. And for the last 11 years, we work by providing and collecting a lot of information on the natural resource development, social and economic development. And at the Paris Peace Forum, we will present and also share our experience, especially at this panel discussion on how open data can promote and protect the indigenous and ethnic minority in Cambodia. We work and provide the training, capacity building, raising awareness about the digital literacy and how indigenous people can use technology to promote and also protect their natural resource. Thank you.
No, thank you very much. So let's deep dive into a few of the projects and the specific aspects of each of your projects. So I'll start on my left with Janet. Janet, yesterday we had a good conversation at your booth also on impact. And your project, the Mexico Indigenous Rights Observatory, has proven to be an effective solution, to fulfill the rights of and advance the development of indigenous communities. You were mentioning your association is a bridge to between the governments and the partners and also indigenous community. But could you explain a bit more concretely how protecting rights is also translating into concrete advancements in standards of living, in poverty reductions? And so can you say a few words about that?
Sí, por supuesto, Alexis. Bueno,
yes, of course, Alexis.
Los pueblos indígenas,
indigenous peoples,
para mí,
as far as I'm concerned,
algo aspiracional.
are a form of aspiration. I have great admiration and respect for them. They are the soul and the essence of Mexican land, of America itself, and I think the world. These are the original people that brought to life, and they are full of culture and wisdom, and we have to learn from them. One of the things that I was very surprised about when I started in this is that in general, they are suffering enormous poverty. They're excluded, they're discriminated against, whereas they are the best of society. And what we need is what I call a route of life, so that we can learn from them as role models. We have set up a working method that addresses physical, human, economic, productive, productive and citizen approaches to development. There are, of course, links between them, and we have to realize what, in quantitative and qualitative terms, the impact is, because we have to learn that indigenous peoples are trustworthy, they keep their word, and therefore they are guardians of everything that's best. And we have to be able to give an account of what they're achieving. And we have to realize that it is possible to achieve things, to combat extreme poverty in peoples. It's not difficult over the long term. And we have to create what I would call an epidemic of deep love for indigenous peoples around the world, because that's where we find the roots of a route to a better life that we all have a place in, and we need to search for this land, this earth that we all deserve.
I have now a question to Silvana and to Tri. In your respective projects, you are collecting a lot of data and information on traditional indigenous knowledge and livelihoods. Could you explain a bit and illustrate how this work not only preserves the rights of your communities, but also provide solutions for wider purposes on environmental conservation or data literacy or climate action? So the link between data and bigger purposes. Is it okay with the translation?
¿Empiezo yo?
Silvana, yeah, fine.
Ok. Bueno,
Is it my turn? Okay. Well, the project is about producing a register, which is, of course, something that requires an administrative procedure. And it's about providing protection to the rights holders. It shows who has the rights and who should be beneficiary. And this provides a lot of official level information. It's quite difficult to get official information in Peru. Usually, it's all about information that comes from a lot of NGOs or indigenous peoples' organizations themselves, but getting official approved data that is recognized by the state is very difficult. So we need what we call registered, recorded information. That gives us information about the ownership and rights of indigenous peoples. Now, this process of proving indigenous rights requires certain concrete steps. As our Colombian colleague said, it's about legal certainty concerning land and territory. We need this so as to be able to reinforce the rights applicable to that area. And you know that there are a lot of environmental activists who have been killed in Peru. It happened. And recently these were indigenous leaders in Peru, people combating illegal logging and mining because there are huge natural resources in those areas. As people were saying, the indigenous peoples have knowledge and customs that produce schemes for protection because they're in harmony with the land. So boosting the understanding and recognition of these rights is important because by recognizing them, it's a form of protection. And it's not just about Peru because we share certain areas with Brazil and Colombia and other countries. So it's really transfrontier. It's regional. And the more information we have, the more we have recognition of indigenous leaders, the better we'll be able to protect our heritage. We've lost a lot of traditional knowledge and culture in Peru because unscrupulous people have removed them from the country. And this is wealth that doesn't return ever to the indigenous peoples. So we need to put in place these economic mechanisms that will improve living standards in our villages. This is the information we need. We've started recently. There was a study in the Madre Dios region where we recorded 300 different traditional forms of knowledge. But there's more than that. This register, we look at intercultural issues, and it's important to have an intercultural, swifter process that doesn't require a third-party project. So this is about recognizing the territory and natural resources. Thank you.
Also, just say for the audience that it's the channel 0 for interpretation from Spanish, in Spanish. Tri, can you add some perspectives from Open Cambodia, like your project, what's building on what Silvana said?
Thank you so much. Actually, we not only just to collect the data to address the lack of information sharing among the general public and also indigenous people, but we also provide a lot of training and capacity building to the indigenous community so that they can understand about the current development of the in Cambodian, especially around economic and social development. As you know, the culture, natural resource is very tight with the culture and also protect of the indigenous livelihood and also their conservation area. And by having the training capacity building to the indigenous people, so they can not only understand about the development, but also can involve with the policy making process. So we do a lot of training and capacity building, and especially we note that the data is available. It's only available in Khmer language, but it's also difficult for the indigenous people because they have their own language. So what we try to do is to translate the material and also resource into their language so that they have a better understanding and they could involve with all the process, especially surround development in their area.
No, thanks. Let me focus now on the experience in Colombia. Could you explain, Milady, a bit on the principles of the indigenous guard, like Kiwe Tegnas, like, and sorry for my pronunciation if it's not perfect. What are like the peaceful tools that you are using to actually protect your territory and the environment? Can you share a bit like the principles and the tools of a guard? No?
Bueno, como lo decía, la Guardia Indígena es uno de los procesos que tenemos para defender el territorio
that's one
basados
of
en
the
que
processes for protecting our territory.
la
For us
tierra
as
es nuestra madre, ¿no?
indigenous peoples, we see the earth as our mother.
Digamos, ejerce varios procesos en ese sentido. Uno que
These
tiene que ver con el
people
proceso de
are involved
formación,
in various processes. Training is one of them.
a la sociedad en general y al mundo en general,
in order to
pues, la
teach
necesidad
society
de
and the world in
defender este
general
territorio,
about the need
precisamente
to
por la
defend
vida
these
que nos
areas.
genera. Del mismo sentido, hay, digamos, un asunto
where we have
muy
all our
importante
roots.
para nosotros, que es el
This
tema de la
is
espiritualidad.
also
De
touching
acuerdo,
on something that's very
digamos,
important for us,
eso,
spirituality,
también se trabaja un componente en ese sentido, que busca
because
desde
we work
nuestros
on
mayores,
that
desde nuestros sabedores,
so that our
poder
elders, our
proteger el
wise
territorio, que es
elders
una
can explain how
protección
to
que
protect the
física o
territory.
materialmente no se ve, pero que para
Physically,
nosotros
material
es
is not something
fundamental.
you can
La
necessarily
Guardia
see, but
también
it's
ejerce, digamos, un
vital
control
for us.
territorial, algo así como
These
desplazamientos por
girls
todo el territorio, con el fin, digamos,
are allowed
de cuidar de
to
que quienes habitan en el
travel
territorio
across all the
protejan
territory
como lo que para
and
nosotros son
know
espacios
who
de vida,
is
es
moving
decir,
from it,
el
because
asunto
these are
medioambiental.
spaces
Hay
of
que
life.
recordar que en
This is the
Colombia pues
environment
tiene mucha
that
biodiversidad
in
y gran
Colombia
parte
is
es
very
el
rich
tema de
in terms
páramos.
of
Y precisamente nosotros
biodiversity.
estamos ubicados en un
And
sector donde se
we
produce la
are
mayor cantidad
located
de agua en el
in
país.
the area that
Y
produces
eso
most of
hace,
the
digamos, un
water
trabajo
resources in the
adicional
country,
la Guardia, que es
and
cómo proteger esos
that
espacios
is
que
part
le
of the
aportan
guards'
mucho en
task. They
términos
have to
ambientales, no solamente a Colombia,
protect these
sino a
areas,
la
the
humanidad. Entonces,
source
en ese
of
sentido,
many
es otro de
environmental
los espacios que
resources
ejerce
for
la
Colombia and
Guardia.
the world in general. That
Además
is one of the
que
things that they
hemos
do.
venido
And also,
implementando últimamente cómo
recently we
proteger,
have been
no solamente
implementing
de
ways
quienes
of
llegan, sino un
protecting
ejercicio, bueno, se denominaría como la reforestación de todos esos espacios.
the area for reforesting, sort of army of reforestation.
En este nuevo contexto que
And
tenemos
in
un
this
nuevo presidente
new
en donde hay una
context now that we
apuesta
have a new
importantísima para el tema de
president
paz, lo que
that
buscamos es que la
has
Guardia Indígena
committed
sea
to peace,
reconocida como ese actor de
what
paz,
we
teniendo en
want is
cuenta
the
pues que la
indigenous guards
Guardia
to be
ejerce un control sin
recognized
ningún
as a
armas
force
más
for
que,
peace.
digamos, nuestro símbolo de
And the
autoridad.
only arms we have is
Entonces,
these
eso es, digamos,
buttons of
lo que buscamos
authority,
y que ha sido
and
una
that's what we're
herramienta
trying to
fundamental
do.
para nosotros,
And this
para
is
el
one of the main
reconocimiento,
tools
pero
for
también
us
para la
to achieve
preservación y la defensa de los
recognition
derechos humanos.
and preservation and protection of
Thank you
human
very much.
rights. Thank
So
you.
you mentioned also like all the benefits that the Guard has beyond the territory of the NASA people, and that's also useful for that. Like I want to just take one point that you mentioned, like with the new, is it like the translation not working on zero? Try zero. It's okay. So you mentioned like you have like a new president also like with a lot of focus on peace. Can I take like taking a step back? Like your three organizations work in Latin America. Can you share like a few words about like the specific regional context or possible similarities between your work? And I will then ask Tri also to reflect maybe from Asia, from Cambodia. What are like the possible differences or like what are like the challenges also?
Bueno, en
Well,
mi país,
in my country,
tanto los pueblos en México,
yeah, Mexico, that's
los
right.
pueblos indígenas
Indigenous
están
peoples
excluidos. O sea,
are excluded.
bueno, aparentemente el gobierno dice que los toma en
Apparently,
cuenta.
the government is saying that they're addressing this issue, but they have removed many of the programs and health support schemes. So the organization of civil society is very important, but it is excluded in Mexico, a country who has lost its civil society organization is in a serious state. And I think it can't operate properly. I think this Paris Peace Forum is a space for hope so that we can build those bridges, because I think what we need to do as human beings is work together, as indigenous peoples do. I have learned from them, and I think I've become a better human being thanks to my contact with them. They don't think about individuals, they think about the collective. They are thinking more about being than having. And these are the sort of things that the world needs, where words are kept. And I think that that's what we'll need to work towards, see how we can build ourselves and make sure that all the restrictions and the obstacles that hold us back from full development, we need to eliminate those for everybody, in particular the indigenous peoples, because this is referred to in all the declarations of rights. Access to water, for example, is inconceivable that people should not be able to access water, and we have to respect their independence, autonomy, their resources, access to decent work, and the environment that they can protect. But everyone has said these are the values that we need to work on, because they work in teams together. We need to work across all sectors of society so that we can work together to make sure that these peoples around the world do well, because if they do well, the world will do better. And bit by bit, we have to see what we can do. Starting with water, next would be food, then the economy, not migration. And in this way, we can solve some of the major international problems.
These priorities are very important. Is it the same in Peru? Like, can you, like you mentioned also, like previous exchanges or regional exchanges of your project? Can you share your perspective?
Hablar de estabilidad y contexto político en Perú es bastante complicado.
It's difficult to talk about political stability in Peru. Over recent years, we have had constantly rotating presidents, and we have a difficult political situation with confrontations with the parliament. But despite all these problems, we as Peruvians have been progressing, and this hasn't prevented us from wanting to work together. I think it's important to recognize this. In Peru, I think a clear example of how far we are from the recognition of indigenous people's rights was COVID. In the pandemic, we were badly hit, and there were all sorts of problems that occurred. We're not an intercultural country. There was no access to health services, to education, and it was the indigenous peoples who were excluded most, who suffered most. So we realized that we didn't have minimum health services even, and we realized that until we have those basic health services and other rights, we won't move forward. What we've tried to do is see how we can improve the situation of indigenous peoples, and in my association we have been focusing on how we can strengthen institutions and the representation of indigenous peoples in them to protect their rights. But it has to be on an equal footing. We don't need external forces for this. We need to listen to another. We need to hear from people to know what they need. We can't continue talking about indigenous peoples without involving the indigenous peoples. Therefore, they have to be representative in fora like the COP. But it's important to have participation of indigenous peoples in such a fora because in Peru, the level of indigenous peoples' territory is large enough to be given a major role in how this is measured, and we cannot forget that despite all this, we are lagging behind in terms of legal certainty. There are lots of breaches of rights. Peru is the only country in which our peoples have to be organized in communities because as peoples, their rights are not recognized. So these are the major challenges, but I would say if I try to see the light at the end of the tunnel, we are moving forward because our organizations are stronger and our representatives is better. That's what we have to go for.
Like, do you take lessons from the work from Mexico and Peru, or what are like the similarities or similar challenges that you have also like in Colombia? You mentioned like also like the changing political context. Could you elaborate a bit more on that, like regional specificities?
Bueno, creo que América Latina tiene eso en común, ¿no?
Well, I think this is something we have in common in Latin America. We are in communities where the rights of indigenous peoples have not been properly guaranteed and protected. But I think the big challenge we have before us as indigenous peoples and communities is that in Latin America, in particular in the south of that area, we have the Amazon forest, and that is something that all the indigenous peoples share. I mean, the concern for protecting it. As everyone knows, the Amazon is the lungs of the planet, and so we need to focus our efforts on continued protection of this area that for us is so important. This is why after more than 500 years in Colombia, where we have had people governing the country who are not too worried about human rights. Now we have a new government, and we hope that this will enable us to keep defending these territories, not as an object, but as an integral part of us. And so we are seeking peace because that is so important, which doesn't just mean absence of armed conflict, but also social justice and fairness across all communities.
Thank you very much for integrating like this, all these different aspects. Tri, like, what's your perspective from Asia, like compared to Latin America, Peru, Colombia, Mexico? What's different? What are like the areas that are in common?
Actually, I see the common challenges are similar, that we face in Cambodia. I just would like to echo what Silvana mentioned about the land recognition for the indigenous community. So in Cambodia, when we talk about land registration for the indigenous community, it would take very long time or process, in comparing to the land, economic land concession and other development process. When the company, they're looking for, like a land area for their development. So it's faster, because, but for the registration of the land for the indigenous people, it might take longer. And another thing is about the participation of the indigenous community. A lot of development projects happening at the ground and where the community located, and the involvement from the indigenous people is still limited, and it needs to have more awareness raising program, especially around environmental impact assessment and how indigenous people can involve with the development project. It could be mining project, economic land concession, and other development projects. And in Cambodia recently, the government, they developed a lot of digital policy, but I see the limitation of the involvement from the indigenous people in the policy development, especially policy related to digital technology. And in the with the low digital literacy and knowledge of the indigenous people, it could be put them as suffering from high risk. Especially around privacy and also digital security and safety for the indigenous people as well.
Thank you very much. So just taking a step back also, like, and coming back to your point also on participation in the COP27. Now it's like the COP27 in Egypt, and we have soon in Montreal, like the COP15 on biodiversity. Like we had also the good discussion with Janet. Can you, the two of you, like reflect also on how can we find pathways to ensure that the voices of like indigenous groups and communities and indigenous peoples are actually heard in these global arenas and that they actually contribute to the global decision-making processes? Janet.
Sí, creo que es fundamental que tengamos en
It's
consideración
absolutely
que estos
vital
espacios
to
fueron
realize that these
creados para el
spaces were
cuidado,
set
la
up
protección de medio
to
ambiente,
care
en el
for
caso
and
de la
protect
COP,
the
en el
environment
caso de
as
este
far as the
Foro para la
COP27
Paz,
is
de la
concerned,
construcción de
and
la paz.
peace and building
Y
peace as far
qué
as the
hacer
PPF is
para ser
concerned.
escuchado.
So what
Como
we need to do in
mencioné,
order to
vengo de un
be
país donde la
heard, well,
sociedad
I come
civil
from a
ha sido
country
excluida.
in
Y
which
eso
there's
es
been
una
exclusion
pena.
of the civil society, which is a great shame.
Estamos aquí en un espacio para
Here we
construir
are in a
juntos
space which
la
is
paz.
about building peace
Entonces,
together.
creo que es
So I
importante
think
que
it's
la
very
sociedad
important
civil
that
esté
civil
en los
society
distintos espacios.
be
Ayer quedamos
present
excluidos
in
como
those
sociedad civil
spaces.
en el
As a civil
espacio de
society, up until
inauguración
now,
donde estuvo el
we have
presidente
been
Macron. A mí me
excluded. We
hubiera
couldn't go
encantado
to the
porque es
opening
un
ceremony
presidente que
yesterday
apuesta
with
por la
President
sociedad
Macron,
civil.
which
Sin
I think is a
embargo,
great
no
shame
teníamos
because
acceso.
they
Y
talk about
podemos volver a
support
caer en
for
el
civil society
problema de la
organizations,
COP.
but we have
Yo
no
estuve
access.
en
As far as
México
the
en la
COP is concerned,
COP16
well,
y
I
cuando
was
llegué
at
ahí
COP16
y
in
no he vuelto a
Mexico,
intentar ir de la
and
mala impresión que tuve y también lo mencionaba el presidente de Colombia en el
as
foro de
the president
inauguración.
of Colombia said yesterday,
Llegaba
there
la
was a
sociedad civil
feeling
y
of
teníamos nada más
unease
un espacio en donde
because
podíamos tomar café y galletitas.
we
Y
had
la
a
sociedad
space where
civil
we were
no vamos a
able
un
to
espacio como el Foro de la Paz de París,
chat
ni a la COP
and have a
a
cup of
validar
coffee and eat biscuits,
procesos.
but we're not
Vamos
usually
a ser
invited to
escuchados, a ser tomados en cuenta y hablo
things
como
like
sociedad
the
civil.
Paris
Y
Peace
por eso
Forum.
estoy
And it's
en Francia,
important to be
porque
here
mi
and to be
país
heard.
me
This is why I'm
excluyeron como sociedad
heard,
civil,
why
porque el
I'm
presidente
here,
cree que no
because in my
somos
country,
valiosos, que no podemos
we've
aportar
been
nada.
excluded
Y fue
because
muy fácil a la
our
manera
president thinks we're
dictatorial
useless
excluir a la
and
sociedad
we
civil.
can make no contribution. So there's
Aquí me
been this
extrañó
very
ayer que
strict
no
exclusion
pudiéramos
from the
participar en
process.
ese
So I
importante
found
foro.
it very
Y les comento
disappointing
que
that they
cuando
didn't
llegué a la
allow
COP,
us to take
yo
part
hablé
in
con el secretario
yesterday's
particular
session.
del presidente en
And as
ese
far as the
momento, me
COP is
tomó la
concerned, well,
llamada y le dije,
I talked to the president's
secretario,
private
por favor
secretary.
dígale al presidente,
I
soy
said on the
sociedad
phone,
civil,
tell the
estamos en
president,
México siendo
please,
anfitriones,
that
no veo pueblos
we
indígenas en la
are the host
COP16,
country
no veo
in
sociedad
Mexico,
civil.
but we don't see the civil
A los 15
society or
minutos me
indigenous
estaban
peoples
hablando, me
represented.
estaban diciendo, por favor,
And
contacta
they
pueblos,
said, well,
que un
get in
listado
touch
para que se vengan
with
inmediatamente en un avión
indigenous
de la Fuerza
peoples so
Aérea.
that they
Y
can
el
be flown
plenario de
in
la
by the Air
COP16
Force
fue
to
destinado por el
the
mismo presidente
plenary of
para que los pueblos
COP16.
indígenas,
And
la
this was
sociedad civil,
done
levantaran la voz.
so that we
Y
could
se
hear
sentó
the
ahí el
voices
presidente y dijo, no me
of
importa si esto
the
va a tomar
indigenous peoples.
45 o 30
And
minutos o 5 horas.
the
Estoy aquí
president
para
said,
escucharles,
I
para
don't care if it
responder
takes
sus
5
preguntas.
hours
Creo que lo que necesitamos como
or what.
ciudadanos del
We
mundo,
are here to
si
listen as
realmente
citizens
queremos
of the
cambiar
world.
las cosas,
If we really
es
want to
realmente
change
no
things, it's very
simular. ¿Por qué?
important not to
Porque un foro
pretend,
tan nuevo, tan llamativo,
because
tan
in
importante, que
a
es
forum
esperanzador
that
para todos
is
nosotros,
so
para
important
llevar
and
la voz de
raises
los
hopes
pueblos,
for
de
us,
lograr una América unida, una
we
América
have
unida a
to
través de
have our
sus
voice heard
pueblos,
so that we can
tiene
have
que
an
empezar
America
construyendo,
that's
escuchando
united.
las voces
And
de
therefore,
todos,
to do
no
that, we have to
tomando las
have all
decisiones en
voices heard,
cortito con la
not
sociedad civil donde viene, participa, pero
take
no es
decisions
incluida en
behind the
los
backs
procesos,
of civil
en esas
society.
decisiones.
They need to be involved. Thank
30
you.
seconds, Silvana. Do you want to comment on that? Because I want to also give space possibly for question to Romanek.
Qué difícil hacerlo en un minuto, pero
sí.
yo creo que hemos avanzado.
Well, in 30 seconds it's going to be difficult, but I think we've made
Hay una
progress
elevación indígena muy
as
fuerte.
far as COP is concerned.
Está,
There is a strong
representados
indigenous
a nivel de
delegation
diferentes países de
that
la región de Sudamérica.
represents a number of
Creo
countries from South America.
necesitamos seguir
I think
fortaleciendo
what
la
we need
participación en los
is continue
espacios, pero también
strengthening
no
our
solamente
participation
a
in
nivel
such
de
events,
espacios
but
de
not
participación
just
en eventos paralelos.
in the side events, we have to be fully represented in the negotiating sessions. As I've said, we can't talk about indigenous matters without indigenous peoples. They have to be involved. I think there are two things at the moment that are going to be discussed at length at the COP. The role of environmental defenders against the background of climate change, because we have the impression that the role of these people need to be protected because they are vulnerable. So we need to keep focusing on the need to ensure that this is a standing forum to discuss all these issues. There are official UN documents recognizing the role of indigenous people in terms of environmental protection. So it's important to include them in these spaces with their voices and votes. That is how we'll be reflected and enabled to play a role.
Sorry to rush you, but like 30-second maximum, because I want to give the opportunity to the audience to ask at least one question. So in 30 seconds, Milady, what are your key priorities for the GORD, for your projects in 2023 and for next year? And also which booth can the participants come and meet you?
Bueno, creo que yo plantearía tres asuntos. El
I
primero
would think there are
que
three
tiene que ver con
things.
seguir construyendo paz.
We have to continue building peace. In the framework of these processes, we have to not just listen to people, but implement real policies on the international scene, leading towards the recognition of people who are doing things on the ground. This is what we've tried to do. So recognition to start with. Secondly, we're focusing on facing up to the climate crisis. And in this context, it's very important, therefore, in various areas around the world to ensure that the voices of these indigenous peoples and communities are heard. That's also a top priority for us, to ensure that indigenous peoples are recognized as authorities in our environments, and we have to guarantee and build a peace that's important for all communities around the world. Thank you.
30-second maximum, like key priorities, what are you expecting from the forum? And because I really want to have at least one question from the audience.
For our priority right now, not only just to keep to data collection and up-to-date information for indigenous community, but also do the outreach activities around digital literacy, digital data literacy training for indigenous people. And another thing is encourage indigenous community involved with the digital development policy and regulation as well. So that's our main priority. And please feel free to visit our booth at booth numbers 30 for the detailed information about our program.
Which booth are you, Janet?
27.
Well, Silvana's booth is just next to the 27, so that's good. And which booth number are you?
Nuestro stand es el número 29.
Okay, so all
29.
I think we have 3 minutes for questions, like one here, or that was the first one.
And thank you so much. My name is Pashtun Zirak and I'm from Afghanistan. I'm a student here in Paris. I have a question that since the fall of Democratic Republic of Afghanistan, the civil societies are not working because of the Taliban, which is an extremist group. They are in power in Afghanistan, and they came to power being in a political transition in a Doha agreement with the United States. What is your opinion and what is your suggestion for the civil societies in Afghanistan? Even the women are blocked at home and they cannot go to school and job, so they are not allowed. What is your experience and what is your suggestion for Afghans civil society? Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question. So lessons from your experiences on creating the space also for another context in Afghanistan where the civic space is shrinking. Do you want to have it, Silvana?
Yo creo que la lucha de las mujeres es difícil a nivel mundial. De repente
women's fight is difficult everywhere, perhaps not as hard as you were explaining, but in Peru, There has always been a lasting effort to achieve equal rights for women, in particular indigenous women. It was a long and difficult process to get those rights recognized because they were discriminated against and they were denied access to basic rights. As a civil society, it's not just about improving the legal situations, but highlighting the problems. That's something we can do as civil society organizations, put the spotlight on discrimination and where changes are not taking place, because it's very important to make sure that is done to get change made. If we don't highlight the importance of women's role in this struggle, we are losing cultural heritage in Peru. So it's important to cast a light on and show what is happening.
Sorry, Janet, because it's like one word. Or maybe you can finish like offstage, like good, like to create this connection. So I'm very honored, and thank you very much for all these wise contributions. And I felt very privileged, to listen to your views and to your experience from Mexico, from Peru, from Colombia and Cambodia. And I invite all the participants also to follow the conversations and to continue the conversation at the booth. And I think the time is over. So thank you very much to all and to the people also online. Thanks.